The morning Doris Freely died, her roses were in full bloom. I know because I was the one who watered them the night before, standing in her side yard with the hose kinked under my arm, while she sat on the porch and told me for the third time that week about the letter she'd gotten from the HOA. She said it like she always said things that bothered her, which was quietly, and with her hands folded in her lap, like she was praying over it. "They want me to repaint the mailbox post," she said. "They say the color doesn't match anymore." The post was white. It had been white for 22 years. The same white she and Carl painted it the summer they moved in, back when the neighborhood was just a developer's promise and a handful of families willing to believe in it. Carl had been dead for 6 years by then, and Doris had kept that post painted, kept the yard neat, kept the roses fed with coffee grounds and eggshells like her mother taught her. She was 81 years old and she had never once gotten a violation letter before that spring. Then she got 4 in 6 weeks. The mailbox post. A crack in the driveway that was supposedly wider than allowed. A garden flag. A garden flag that they said counted as an unapproved decorative structure. And then the last one, which came 3 days before she died, telling her the exterior trim on her garage was peeling, and she had 30 days to remediate or face daily fines of $50. I saw that letter. The trim wasn't peeling. It had a single blister of paint the size of a quarter, up near the roof line where you'd need a ladder and a reason to look. Someone had gone looking for it. Someone had climbed up or used binoculars or walked her property line with the specific intention of finding something wrong with Doris Freely's house. Her son, Michael, lived in Reno. He called every Sunday and sent grocery money once a month. He didn't know about the letters because Doris didn't want to worry him. She told me that too, sitting on that porch, her hands still folded. She said she'd figure it out. She said maybe she could get a neighbor boy to help with the painting. She said $50 a day would eat through her savings in 2 months, and then she didn't finish the sentence. Doris died on a Tuesday. Heart gave out in her sleep, which the doctor said was not unexpected for a woman her age with her history. And maybe that's true. Maybe 81-year-old hearts just stop sometimes and it has nothing to do with anything. But I had watched that woman walk her yard every evening for the past 3 years, without a hitch in her step. And in those last weeks she moved like someone carrying something she couldn't set down. She moved like the house she'd loved for 2 decades had turned on her, and she couldn't understand why. The roses kept blooming after she was gone. Nobody watered them, but we had a wet May, and they didn't know yet that the person who'd cared for them wasn't coming back. Michael came down for the funeral and stayed a week to sort through things. He found the letters in a kitchen drawer, stacked neatly under a rubber band, and he brought them to me because Doris had told him I was the neighbor she trusted. He stood in my doorway holding those letters, and he looked like a man who had just discovered a bruise on someone he should have been protecting. He asked me if I knew who was behind it. I told him I had a pretty good idea. He asked me what he should do. I told him to sit down, because it was going to take a minute, and because what I had to tell him started before the letters and went further than he probably expected. He sat down, and I told him about Gerald Kessler. The first one showed up on a Tuesday, which Linda always said was the worst day of the week for surprises. At least on a Monday you're braced for it. She was out watering the roses, the ones Gerald had put in the spring before he got sick, the ones she'd kept alive through 2 droughts, and one particularly vindictive winter, because letting them die felt like letting another piece of him go. When a white sedan pulled up to the curb, not a neighbor's car, not the mail carrier, the kind of clean, anonymous vehicle that belongs to someone who has somewhere specific to be and doesn't care whether you're ready for them. The woman who stepped out was maybe 35, hair pulled back tight, clipboard in hand. She wore a polo shirt with the Ridgewood Commons Homeowners Association logo embroidered on the chest, which Linda had seen exactly twice in the 11 years she'd lived here. Once at closing, once when they'd sent someone around after the tornado in 2019 to photograph damage for insurance coordination. That had been a man named Phil, who'd apologized for bothering her and accepted a glass of sweet tea. This woman did not look like she'd be accepting sweet tea. "Mrs. Dillard, Linda Dillard." "That's me. I'm Cassandra Welch, Compliance Coordinator for Ridgewood Commons HOA. I'm here to conduct a property assessment pursuant to Section 4.7 of the Community Covenant." Linda turned off the hose. She did it slowly, not because she was trying to make a point, but because the spigot handle had been stiff since March and she had to use both hands. "A property assessment," she repeated. "That's correct. We've received a complaint regarding several potential violations on your property, and I'm here to document current conditions." "A complaint from who?" "Complaints are submitted confidentially. I'm sure you understand." Linda did not understand. She'd lived on Sycamore Court for over a decade. She'd never received a violation notice. She'd never received a warning. She'd paid her dues on time every single quarter, even the year they raised them 14% with 30 days' notice, and half the neighborhood threatened to revolt. "What kind of violations are we talking about?" Cassandra Welch looked down at her clipboard the way a doctor looks at a chart before delivering news they've already decided isn't their problem. "Exterior paint outside approved palette, unapproved landscaping modifications, storage of non-conforming items visible from the street, potential structural addition without architectural review committee approval." "Structural addition?" "The shed. That shed has been there since 2016. Our records don't show an approved application for it." Linda looked at the shed. It was 8 by 10, cedar, built by Gerald and their son-in-law over a long weekend. It held garden tools and a push mower and 3 boxes of Christmas decorations she kept meaning to sort through. It had been there through 2 HOA board elections, 3 annual neighborhood cookouts, and 1 visit from that very same association after a tornado, and nobody had said a word about it. "I'd like to walk the property now if that's all right," Cassandra said, already moving toward the side gate. "And if it's not all right?" Section 3.2 grants the association right of reasonable exterior inspection with or without homeowner accompaniment. "I can proceed either way, but we prefer cooperation." There it was, that word cooperation, delivered the way people deliver it, when they mean compliance and don't want to say so. Linda watched this woman she'd never met walk along the fence line of the house she'd lived in for 11 years, photographing the paint on the trim, the garden bed borders, the shed Gerald built, the roses Gerald planted, clicking and scribbling, measuring something near the driveway with a tape measure she pulled from her back pocket, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And Linda stood there holding a garden hose with a stiff handle, thinking 2 things. The first was that somebody on this street had done this to her on purpose. The second was that they had picked the wrong woman. The thing about Marge Kellerman is she never raised her voice. Not once in the 11 years I lived 3 doors down. Not when her husband passed, not when the ice storm took her magnolia, not when the neighborhood kids put a baseball through her kitchen window and she just called their mother and said she understood boys will be boys, but could they help her sweep up the glass? So when the HOA sent that second letter, the one with the red final notice stamp that looked like it was designed to make old women cry, Marge didn't raise her voice then either. She just sat at her kitchen table with her reading glasses on and a yellow legal pad and started writing things down. I know this because I was there. I'd brought over a casserole that Tuesday, the kind you bring when you know someone's going through it, but you don't want to say so directly. Tuna noodle. She hated tuna noodle, but she never told me that until much later. The letter said she owed $1,100 in accumulated fines for a fence that was 3/4 of an inch too tall. 3/4 of an inch. They'd measured it. Someone had actually come to her property with a tape measure while she was at her husband's oncologist and measured her fence and found it wanting. What Marge did next is the part most people skip when they tell this story, because it isn't dramatic. It isn't satisfying in the way people want stories to be satisfying. She went to the county recorder's office. She went on a Wednesday morning when it was raining, and she wore her blue raincoat, and she asked the woman at the counter for the original plat survey of Briarwood Estates, filed 1987. Then she asked for the amended CC and Rs from 1994 and 2003 and 2011. Then she sat in one of those hard plastic chairs under the fluorescent lights, and she read every single page. She did this for 3 Wednesdays in a row. I drove her the second and third times because her car was making a noise she didn't trust. We didn't talk much on those drives. She had her legal pad and her glasses, and sometimes she'd make a small sound, a quiet and write something down. And I learned not to ask what she'd found because she wasn't ready to say. What I can tell you is what was happening beneath the surface of all that quiet reading. Marge had been a compliance auditor for the State Department of Insurance for 27 years before she retired. 27 years of reading regulations and finding the places where the language said one thing and the practice said another. She had a mind like a river, slow on top, relentless underneath, carving through stones so gradually you didn't notice until the whole bank gave way. The board didn't know this about her. To them, she was the widow in the grey house with the garden gnomes and the fence that was 3/4 of an inch too tall. They had sent her 2 letters and they expected what they always got, which was payment or compliance or both, delivered with the quiet shame of someone who believes they have done something wrong. What they did not expect was what Marge was building on that yellow legal pad, line by careful line. She found the discrepancy on the 3rd Wednesday. I know because she made that sound again, that small And then she closed the binder and took off her glasses and looked at me and said, very calmly, I think we should get lunch. We went to the diner on Poplar. She ordered a patty melt and a coffee, and she didn't mention the CC and Rs or the fine or the fence until she had finished every bite. Then she folded her napkin and she said, they amended the architectural standards in 2003, but they never filed the amendment with the county, which means every fine they've issued under those standards for the last 20 years is unenforceable. She took a sip of her coffee. Every single one. The thing about paper is it doesn't forget. People forget. People revise what they said, what they meant, what they intended. Paper just sits there in its folder being exactly what it was the day somebody signed it. Maren found the letters on a Tuesday, not hidden exactly, but filed in a way that suggested someone hoped they'd never be found. Tucked behind the appliance warranties in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, Gerald had kept in what he called his office, but was really just the back half of the guest bedroom with a desk in it. Gerald had been dead 11 months by then, and Maren had been putting off that drawer the way you put off anything that belongs to someone who isn't coming back to explain it. There were 14 letters total, 11 from the HOA board, specifically from Dale Presswood, who signed everything as President Cedarbrook Commons Homeowners Association, like the title was a military rank. 3 were copies of letters Gerald had sent back. Gerald's were typed clean on plain white paper, no letterhead, because Gerald didn't need letterhead to say what he meant. The first HOA letter was dated 3 years prior. It cited a violation of Section 4.12 of the Community Covenants, something about exterior paint colors requiring pre-approval. Maren remembered that. Gerald had painted the trim around the garage a shade called heron blue. It was barely different from the grey it replaced. You'd have to stand in the driveway with a paint chip to notice. But Dale noticed. Dale always noticed. The letters escalated the way these things do when one person has a clipboard and the other person has a life. Fines. Warnings about fines. Warnings about fines. A letter about the mailbox post being 4 inches shorter than the approved standard. A letter about a seasonal wreath that contained unapproved artificial berries. A letter about the truck, Gerald's work truck, the one he drove to job sites, being parked in the driveway for more than the permitted 72 consecutive hours. Maren read them in order, sitting on the floor of that half office with her back against the filing cabinet, and she could feel the shape of something she hadn't fully understood while Gerald was alive. He'd mentioned the HOA stuff sometimes, made it small, said Dale was just being Dale, said it wasn't worth the energy of getting upset about. But Gerald had kept every single letter, filed them in order, and his 3 responses were not the words of a man who thought it wasn't worth the energy. The first response was polite, requested the specific subsection of the covenant that governed trim paint, and asked whether the board had followed its own review process before issuing the fine. The second was firmer, pointed out that the mailbox post measurements cited in the violation letter didn't match the measurement standard listed in the covenants themselves. Dale had referenced an outdated version of the document. The third was the one that made Myron set the papers down and press her palms against her eyes. It was dated 14 months before Gerald died. It was addressed not to Dale, but to the full board. It listed, in Gerald's plain and careful way, 11 separate instances where the same violations cited against their property existed on other homes in Cedarbrook Commons. Homes that had received no letters, no fines, no warnings. Gerald had walked the neighborhood with a tape measure and a camera. He had documented everything. The letter ended with a single line that Myron read 3 times. I am asking the board to explain why enforcement of these covenants has been applied selectively to my property, and I am asking in writing so that the answer, whatever it is, will also be in writing. There was no reply from the board in the folder. Gerald had asked his question, and the silence that came back was its own kind of answer. Myron gathered the letters, squared their edges against the floor, and carried them to the kitchen table where the light was better. She wasn't grieving in that moment. She was paying attention. The thing about Marjorie Kint is she never once raised her voice. Not when they sent the first letter about the mailbox post being 3 inches too far left. Not when they fined her $40 for a garden hose visible from the street. Not even when Dale Pressler stood on her front porch with his clipboard and his polo shirt tucked into khakis that had never seen honest work and told her the fence she'd built for her late husband's dog was in violation of Section 9.4.2 and needed to come down within 14 days, or she'd face escalating penalties starting at $200 a month. She just nodded, took the paper, closed the door softly. That was October. By December, the fines had reached $800, and Dale had filed a lien notice. He'd done this before to other people on Briarwood Lane, the Nguyens, Carl Oster, the young couple renting the split level on the corner who just packed up and left rather than fight it. Dale had a system. He'd find something small, something technical, something most people wouldn't even know was in the covenants, because most people don't read 46 pages of deed restrictions for fun. He'd send the letter, then the follow-up, then the fine, then the lien, and by the time anyone thought about pushing back, the numbers were big enough to scare them into compliance or silence. It worked because most people don't know what a lien actually means. They just hear the word and think they're about to lose their house. Marjorie knew what a lien meant. See, what Dale didn't bother to find out, what he never bothered to find out about anyone because the clipboard and the polo shirt had always been enough, was that Marjorie Kint had spent 31 years as a paralegal for a firm in Richmond that specialized in community association law. She had retired 4 years ago when Tom got sick. She had moved to Briarwood Lane because it was quiet and close to the hospital, and because Tom had always wanted a yard where the dog could run. Tom died in March. The dog was old and mostly blind and liked to sleep against the fence in the afternoon sun. So when Marjorie nodded and took that paper and closed the door softly, she wasn't surrendering. She was reading. She read every page of the covenants. She read the bylaws. She read the amendment history, which she had to request 3 times before the board finally produced it. And when they did, she noticed that the 2019 amendment to Section 9 had never been ratified by the required 2/3 homeowner vote. It had been approved by the board alone, which meant it wasn't enforceable, which meant every fine issued under it, Not just hers, but the Nguyens, Carl's, all of them, had no legal standing. She wrote a letter, 7 pages, single-spaced, cited the state code, cited the association's own governing documents, cited 3 precedents from Virginia appellate courts that she had helped research herself back when she was still working. She sent copies to every homeowner on the street. She sent a copy to the management company. She sent a copy to Dale. I know all this because I lived 2 doors down, and I was one of the people who got that letter in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning in January. And I stood in my kitchen reading it with my coffee going cold, and I thought, oh, this is what it looks like when someone who actually knows what they're doing decides to stop being polite. The board called an emergency meeting for the following Thursday. Dale tried to move it to a closed session. Marjorie showed up with 11 homeowners and a printed copy of the state statute requiring open meetings for any action affecting assessments or liens. She still never raised her voice. But I'll tell you what, when she set that stack of paper on the table in the community room and looked at Dale Pressler over the top of her reading glasses, something in the air cracked, like a fracture running through glass that everyone had been pretending was solid. The morning after the board meeting, Nora drove past the Hendersons' old place and saw that someone had already removed the memorial bench from the front yard. Not the city, not the family. Someone with a truck and no conscience and probably a laminated copy of Section 4.12 regarding unauthorized fixed structures in residential front setbacks. She kept driving. The thing about Gerald Pruitt was that he never did his own dirty work before sunrise. He scheduled it. He had a calendar for pettiness. A whole system. Violation letters went out on Tuesdays. Lien threats on the 1st of the month. And anything that required physical removal of someone's property happened between 5 and 7 in the morning, when most people were still trusting enough to be asleep. Nora had learned his rhythms the way you learn the habits of a dog that bites. She parked at the coffee shop on Ridgeland and opened her laptop. The files she'd scanned from Bev's kitchen table were organized now, dated and cross-referenced in a spreadsheet she'd built during 3 sleepless nights. Every fine, every lien, every selective enforcement. She had the Garcia's rain barrel citation next to the Whitmore's identical rain barrel that had never been touched. She had the Johnson's fence repaint demand alongside aerial photos showing Gerald's own fence, peeling down to bare wood since 2019. She had 11 families fined for parking violations on the same weekend the board held a fundraiser and every board member's guest parked on the street without consequence. 11 families. That was the number that mattered. Not because it was large, but because every single one of them had agreed to sign. That was what the last 2 weeks had cost her. Not the research, which was tedious, but simple. Not the legal framework which Ray Castillo had outlined for her in exchange for nothing more than a decent meal and the chance to finally use his retired attorney brain on something that made him angry in a productive way. The cost was the conversations. Sitting in living rooms and kitchens and on porches with people who had been worn down so gradually, they didn't even recognize the shape of what had happened to them. People who said things like, well, that's just how it is and I don't want to make trouble. And we thought about selling, but the market isn't right. Nora had listened to every one of them. She did not rush. She did not pitch. She brought the spreadsheet and she showed them their own name next to someone else's name. And she let the pattern speak. Marcus Webb, who had paid $2,300 in fines over a boat he kept in his own driveway, looked at the spreadsheet for a long time and then said, I knew it. He said it quietly, like a man confirming something he had carried alone for years. Denise Okafor, who had been threatened with a lien over a garden flag, actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because the documentation made it undeniable, and there is a particular kind of relief that comes when someone shows you the evidence of what you already felt in your body. They all signed, everyone. The petition for a special membership meeting required 15% of homeowners in good standing. Nora had 22%. She had Ray's legal review confirming the petition met every procedural requirement in the bylaws. She had the certified mail receipts ready. She had the agenda items drafted, including a vote of no confidence in the current board and a full financial audit going back 5 years. She sat in the coffee shop and looked at all of it laid out on her screen and felt something she had not expected. Not triumph. Not yet. What she felt was the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a weight uphill and has just reached the part of the road where the ground levels out and you can finally see where you are going. She closed the laptop. She finished her coffee. She drove home past the empty spot where the Hendersons' bench had been, and she did not look away from it. Tuesday was tomorrow. Gerald's favorite day. She was ready for it. The morning of the hearing, Dolores ironed her blouse twice because the first time she pressed a crease into the collar that wouldn't sit right. She told me this later, standing in her driveway with the engine still ticking, like the detail mattered. And maybe it did. Maybe when you've spent 11 months being treated like you don't belong in your own home, the way your collar sits is the last thing you can control before you walk into a room full of people who've been pretending you don't exist. She brought the binder, 3 inches thick, tabbed with those little colored flags Marcus had picked up from the office supply store on Route 9. Every letter, every fine, every photograph of the yard they said was in violation, time-stamped and dated alongside photographs of Carl Prawitz's yard taken the same week, showing the same length of grass, the same style of holiday decoration, the same trash bin placement. The difference between Dolores' photos and Carl's was that Carl's never generated a single notice, not one in 14 years. The county mediation board met in a room that smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner, which Dolores said reminded her of the church basement, where Raymond used to run the fish fry on Fridays. She said she almost smiled when she walked in. Almost. There were 7 board members. Dolores knew 3 of their names already because she'd looked them up, read their public comments from prior sessions, understood who asked questions and who just nodded along. She'd done the work. That was the thing people kept missing about Dolores. They saw a 71-year-old widow in a pressed blouse, and they calculated what they thought her capabilities were, and they were wrong every single time. Fenton showed up with the association's attorney, a young man in a suit that fit him like he'd borrowed it from a bigger cousin. He had a folder. 1 folder. Dolores told me she looked at that single folder and felt something settle in her chest. A kind of quiet that she hadn't felt since before Raymond passed. She knew. They let the association present first. The attorney read from the bylaws. He referenced the fines. He used the phrase, consistent pattern of non-compliance 3 times, which Dolores had predicted because she'd read the association's filings and noticed they repeated that language like a chorus in a hymn nobody believed in anymore. Then it was her turn. She didn't raise her voice. She opened the binder to the first tab and she started with the names. Every homeowner on Sycamore Lane who had received a violation notice in the past 3 years. She'd gotten the records through a request she filed herself, no lawyer, just the right form and the right address and the patience to wait 6 weeks for the response. 47 notices total. 41 of them issued to homeowners who, like Dolores, were among the 7 non-white families in a subdivision of 63 homes. She read the names out loud. Each one. Not fast, not slow. Just clear, the way you'd read names at a memorial, because in a sense that's what it was. Each name was a person who'd been told their home wasn't right, their yard wasn't enough, their presence was a problem to be managed. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when the air changes, and everyone knows something has shifted, but nobody wants to be the first to move. Dolores closed the binder. She didn't make a speech. She didn't ask for anything. She just said, "Those are the numbers. Those are the names. I'd like the board to look at them and tell me what they see." She told me that Fenton's face didn't change during any of it. He sat there with his arms crossed and his jaw set, the same expression he wore when he walked her property line with his little clipboard. But the attorney, the young man in the borrowed suit, he closed his folder and didn't open it again. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to argue. It just needs someone willing to iron her blouse twice and read the names out loud. The morning after the board voted to remove Gerald Pruitt, the sky over Cedarbrook Estates was the kind of blue that makes you think somebody up there was paying attention after all. May sat on her front porch with her coffee, same as she did every morning, same mug with the chipped handle she'd been meaning to replace for 6 years. The difference was that for the first time in almost 2, she wasn't bracing for anything. No envelope in the mailbox, no orange violation tag zip-tied to her fence post, no certified letter demanding she appear before a committee of 3 people who'd already decided she was guilty of having the wrong shade of mulch. The quiet felt different now. It felt like it belonged to her again. Across the street, Tom Wexler was already out watering his lawn, which he did every morning at 6:15 regardless of whether it had rained. He saw May and raised his hand. Not a wave exactly. More like an acknowledgement. Tom had been one of the 5 residents who showed up to the emergency meeting. He'd stood in the back with his arms crossed and said nothing until the very end, when he looked Gerald straight in the face and said, "You find my wife for a welcome mat." That was all. It was enough. The thing about winning, and May would be the first to tell you this wasn't really winning, it was just the restoration of something that should never have been taken. The thing about it is that it doesn't undo anything. Her husband's garden was still gone. The roses he'd planted the spring before he died, the ones Gerald had cited as encroaching on the common area by 4 inches, those were pulled up and composted 8 months ago. You don't get those back. You don't get back the evening she sat at her kitchen table and cried over a $65 fine for a bird bath that had been in her yard since before the HOA existed. What you get is the morning after. You get the quiet. You get Tom Wexler raising his hand across the street. She'd thought about saying something at the meeting, after the vote. People looked at her like they expected a speech, but May had said everything she needed to say when she handed over those folders. The ones David had helped her organize, the ones with the selective enforcement records and the financial discrepancies, and the 14 violations Gerald had issued to her property alone in a single calendar year, while his own unpermitted shed sat 30 feet from the property line without so much as a note in the file. The folders spoke. May didn't need to. She heard the screen door next door and looked over to see Lucille coming down her steps with a plate covered in foil. Lucille didn't say good morning. She just walked over, set the plate on the porch railing and said, "Banana bread. Don't let it sit." May pulled back the foil. It was still warm. "I put walnuts in it," Lucille said. "I know you don't love walnuts, but I figure you earned the right to pick them out yourself without somebody writing you up for it." May laughed. It came out rough and surprised, like a door opening that had been painted shut. Lucille sat down in the other chair, the one that used to be Roy's, and neither of them said anything about that either. They sat there for a while. The coffee cooled. The banana bread disappeared in pieces. Down the block, someone had put out a new garden flag, one of those ones with a fat cardinal on it, the kind Gerald would have measured to make sure it didn't exceed the approved 16-inch height limit. Nobody was going to measure it now. May looked at the empty spot in her yard where the roses had been. Come spring, she thought. Come spring, she put something there. She didn't know what yet. She had time to decide. That was the thing she'd gotten back, more than anything. The time, the quiet, the ordinary right to sit on her own porch and not be afraid of her own mailbox. The banana bread was good, even with the walnuts.